Alrighty, gang. Howdy doody, howdy doody, howdy doody. So, how is everybody doing? Great to see everybody. Calvin, Robert, Cowboy, Antrich, Ja A, Poor Life Choices, Brian, Bellis, Benedito, and David Stevens. Great to see everybody. Yeah, Calvin, that's exactly right. Yeah, the reason that some of the contracts went like, our spy put, we did 1,500 on it. But there was a dude on Wall Street Bets that had posted he had done like 5,000% on one of the spy puts, and that's because that man bought like a 416 put while we were trading at 422, and he bought it literally seconds before that thing like cratered. So that's why he made such a larger percentage, is because it was out of the money, and then because of price dropping as quickly as it did, basically just dollar, 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 and that was happening like every like minute to 5 minutes, right? We were literally just dropping dollars, and basically like, this is a good start for the options lesson. Basically, what happens with regards to what happened on SPY that day, with regards to zero data expire options. So Calvin was talking, or he was asking about like, well, he already answered his own question. He already figured out the answer, but he was wondering how people, we had bought puts on SPY up here, some zero data end puts on SPY, right? And we caught this huge move down, and we left a runner contract that went 1,500%. But there were some people, right, that had done 5,000%, right? They had done literally 5,000% on some puts, right? And Calvin's question was, how did that person get 5,000% where our contracts, we all went down the exact same amount, but our contracts only did 1,500%. I say only, but it's just for the purpose of this example, right? So, really, yeah, this is a great way to start off this thing. So thank you, Calvin, actually, for bringing this up. So when I trade SPY, I mostly always trade zero day to end because I just like to get in and get out. And so that's just kind of how I like to do it. And so that's just what I'm going to talk about just for the purpose of this example right here, right? So when we were looking at puts, right, Jackie always talks about that when I take options, whether it's GameStop or SPY or IWM or Tesla or whatever it is that I'm trading, right? Um, Typically I go in the money, right? And so if I say in the money, does everybody understand what I mean when I say in the money, out of the money? Does that make sense to you? And if not, please say no so I can actually pause and talk about this for a moment. But does everybody understand out the money and in the money? That it's like the most basic thing about options, right? So everybody, I think we have a pretty good understanding of in the money and out of the money. So basically, right, what ended up happening, guys, is before this thing took a puke, we entered a put, right? And price was trading at 523. And because we like to go in the money, we took a 524p, right? So we took a 524p. And that netted us from this entry up here to this low that was made down here. That netted us a grand total of 1,500% total, right? 1,500% total. Okay. And the reason that this contract, okay, did not do as much as this 5,000% one did, okay, has to do with out of the money versus in the money. So the person that made this 5,000% on this put on Wall Street Bets, right? This person bought a 514p. Okay. Now think about how degenerate you have to be in order to buy a 514p, right, with 0 days to expire, right? While SPY is in a bullish uptrend and currently trading at essentially 524. You're betting on a $10 drop on SPY, right? You're betting on a $10 drop, right? In a single day on SPY, right? I mean, that's borderline insanity, right? That's actually just degeneracy because SPY, I'm happy to catch like $1, $2, $3, $4 in a day on SPY. And somebody was trying to catch this for $10 in basically like half of a session. And so the reason that this put did 5,000% and did such a higher percentage than the 524p is strictly because it was out of the money. Okay. And one of the things that happens with out of the money options, right? So this person was betting that SPY would get to right here. Okay. Where that green line is, when they entered this short, they were betting that this was going to happen. Right. And that's fucking crazy, but it did happen, right? And the reason that these contracts do such a higher percentage, right? Part one is because the contracts themselves are cheaper, right? So Buddy, who took this 514p, right? He bought this for like, let's just say for, I don't know exactly, right? But let's just say, for example, he paid $10 for each one of these contracts, right? So to do 5,000%, right? 5,000% means that he turned this $10, right, into 500, right? That's what he did. Is he turned the $10 into 500, right? Now here's where the big difference comes in, right? Now, so I know this because I actually took this trade and I actually executed on this and made money on this one. We took this put here for $67, right? We took this for $67, and when it hit the absolute peak of the contract, right? The peak of that contract, we hit roughly, I think it was, I want to say it was 1,300. Okay. So you can imagine, right, that while 5,000%, while it was significantly more of a percentage gain, the amount of risk that had to be taken on, right, because you're betting on a $10 drop on SPY, which is insane. You're actually degenerate. And not only are you betting on a $10 drop on SPY, you're betting that it happens in a very small amount of time, right? This took from noon until 1:30 basically to hit the low. So it took an hour and a half, which is absolutely insane. A $10 sell-off in that amount of time, I can't tell you how insane it is, right? But the point of this all is, right, is that even though we did not make the same percentage gain, look at the dollar for dollar value. Sure, we could have taken a $10 YOLO and prayed, right? But when we were taking this initial trade, we weren't trying to be this guy, right? You're not that guy, pal, right? We were just trying to catch like this move, right? That was all that we wanted. And then we got really blessed and really fortunate, right? And so by staying in the money, right, it allowed us to carry significantly less risk. And then as soon as the trade started going in our direction with regards to our options, right, with regards to our puts, okay, one of the big important things is always taking profit with your options, right? Always taking profit with your options and then setting your stop losses, right? And here's where options, this is where people get really confused with setting stop losses and doing all that kind of stuff, right? It's like, okay, where do I set a stop loss though? Because options, like the price of the option usually is not trading anything close to what the actual price of the asset is trading at, right? And so this is where I'm going to give you the tools and we're going to kind of dive in to how all of these metrics work with regards to options, right? And how you too can also find a way to not just trade SPY, but to trade GameStop options or AMC options or IWM options or whatever stock it is that you want to trade, right? But there's a couple of ground rules that a lot of people, especially if you're new to trading options, right? There's a couple of ground rules that you should really focus on when we're trading options. Okay? So everybody is with me so far? You guys all with me so far? Did that first little opening statement, everybody all good? Everybody with me so far? And again, I always stop in between just to make sure that everybody is with me, everybody understands what I'm talking about. So if you guys just reply in the comments really quick, I can move on. All right, thank you guys. All right. So there's a couple of ground rules with regards to options. Okay? And these ground rules are going to help you protect your ass. Okay? So right here in this purple, whatever, burgundy colored box here, I've listed 4 bullet points. Okay? And these 4 bullet points are in response to every single one of you listening to me right now. Okay? So first, why is IV important? Second, when is a good time to buy options versus shares? 3, how can I protect myself from losing my ass? And lastly, number 4, arguably the most important one, do I understand these enough to trade them? Do you understand options enough to trade them? Because there are a lot of intricacies that are involved with options that can cause you to get your ass beat up really fast. And I don't say it to scare people, but I say it as a warning, because options go to zero. If your option expires, it expires worthless, right? If your option is out of the money and it expires, and you bought that option initially for $200 and it goes to expiration without breaking in the money, right? That option, you will lose all $200. This is not like shares. You don't just buy a share of GameStop for 15 and then it goes to zero. That's not how options versus shares, that's not how this works. Right? Understand that when you buy an option, you are putting in what you are willing to risk. If you buy a $1,000 option, you better understand that you could lose all $1,000 if you don't understand what you're doing. And this has happened to a lot of you listening. This has also happened to myself included. I am not immune from this. I learned a lot of hard lessons, especially trading SPY. Right? You guys have heard me time and time again relentlessly talk about this trend day on SPY that I will never forget, right? And that trend day on SPY, I lost all $200 that I put into a put option, right? And that day taught me a lot of lessons. It taught me a lot of lessons about trading. It taught me a lot of lessons about options, and it taught me a lot about risk management, right? And it's why I mostly stick with shares. But I know a lot of you guys really want to learn options. And so I'm willing to dive into this a little bit and share with you some of this information so that you guys are actually learning the correct way, right? But please understand that things that I am teaching you are not going to be shown in other places because people don't manage risk, right? It is a very rare thing to find risk management and people that will actually teach you risk management, because without risk management, that's how all of these influencers and stuff make their money, is betting on you blowing up and then coming back and giving them more money, and then they teach you these things, right? I'm going to teach you risk management with options, but I do want you guys to understand that if you don't understand what you are doing, do not just go out into the market and start buying $5,000 fucking Tesla puts, right? Or $500 GameStop calls, right? That's not really what I'm trying to show you guys here. What I want you to see, right? What I want you to understand is how all of these things function and how these things function to work against you, right? And so we're going to take the things that you guys learned today and we're going to apply them. And the most important thing that I'm going to teach you today is the fact that the market uses options to against you. They actively use options to cheat you out of your own money, right? And so I'm going to teach you how to protect yourself from getting cheated out of your money. And then I'm also going to teach you, okay, how to actively take advantage of really, really, really good scenarios, right? So you see, I have AMC on the chart. AMC's gamma squeeze is one of the single best ways that I can explain and show you guys options. And a lot of you guys got some great experience with GameStop over the last 4 weeks with regards to the earnings and the implied volatility and how options pricing was some of the most expensive that it had ever been. And so a lot of you guys are really familiar with how the options kind of have been and how they function with GameStop. So I figured I would show you AMC's gamma squeeze. And with regards to AMC's gamma squeeze, how people traded options and how they used them successfully to their advantage. Whether you were buying leaps on AMC or whether you were buying short dated. And so I'm going to explain today for you guys the really big difference between buying leaps. Okay, and if you don't know what leaps are 9-month or longer dated option contracts. Okay, so if you buy an option that has 9 months to expire or greater, it is considered a leap option. So I'm going to show you the difference between a leap, okay, versus a short dated option. And then I will also explain to you, okay, the difference between an out of the money versus an in the money strike for each of those examples. Okay, and then we're going to lastly, I'm actually probably going to talk about this first. We're going to talk about kind of the 3 rules to always pay attention to with regards to options. Because there's 3 specific set of rules that I use all of the time with regards to options that keep me profitable and keep me from losing my ass. Okay, so let's start with the 3 most important things. Okay, so what are the 3 most important things when looking at options? Okay, so number 1 thing to consider, right? Number 1 thing to consider. What is the implied volatility, i.e. IV? Okay, so what is the implied volatility, right? The reason that this is so important, okay, is IV actually is like, think of it like a multiplier for an options contract, okay? And so implied volatility, right? What implied volatility is when the market is anticipating a big movement, implied volatility typically starts to rise, okay? And the reason that it starts to rise is because this is what is called pricing in, okay? The market is pricing in a move, okay? And so when you see implied volatility begin to rise, implied volatility is like a multiplier for everything. So when implied volatility starts to rise, call options become more expensive and put options become more expensive. And it doesn't matter how far out you buy them, whether you're buying them 2 years from now for expiration or whether you're buying an expiration of 2 weeks from now. Implied volatility is a multiplier of all options contracts. Now, I just want to pause and make a quick little star in my thing here and say, a lot of people don't know this or are confused by this. If you buy a put option is not a short. If you buy a put option on a stock and it doesn't go your way, the put that you bought goes to zero. It does not go to infinity loss, okay? So when we have a put option, and let's say we buy a put for $200, if our put expires, it just expires worthless. So what happens is that you just lose that $200 that you bought a put for. So a lot of people have this weird misconception that if you buy a put, it's a short and that you could have infinity losses. That is 1000% false information. You are able to buy puts, and puts are exactly like calls. You guys have bought calls before and lost them and had them go to zero, right? Puts are the exact same. It just means that you bet the wrong way and that it went to zero, okay? So I just wanted to put that little star in there. So is everybody with me so far? Everybody, we're good? Everybody still following along? Everything making kind of sense? No questions, no concerns so far with the with regards to the implied volatility stuff? All good, he says. All good. Okay. My home, yes. All right, good. Scott Baker, yes. Okay, so everybody seems to understand. Okay, so when implied volatility starts to rise, it starts juicing contracts. So the single most important question for me when I'm looking at options contracts is, what is the implied volatility? Is the implied volatility low? So essentially, if implied volatility is low, that essentially means that options contracts, okay, are going to be the cheapest that they have been, right? Because if implied volatility is like the multiplier for options contract, and the multiplier for the options contract is currently at the low, that means that the options contracts themselves are at the low, right? So when I buy options contracts, I am always trying to target stocks that have low IV and look to be at lows on the chart. And the reason I do that is because it answers this question right here. When is a good time to buy options versus shares? In my opinion, a good time to buy options versus shares is directly leading to our number one most important thing when looking at options, and it's where is the implied volatility. The secret sauce, right? The secret sauce for Jackie and his options trades are when the stock is at a low and putting in a reversal formation, and implied volatility is at lows. When implied volatility is at lows and the stock is at lows, that means that I can take a healthy share position as well as a healthy options position and take a risk on it, right? Because there's a train of thought here that essentially says the stock is at a low, it's putting in a reversal formation, and options are as cheap as they have ever been. From a risk-reward perspective, if there was ever an opportunity to make a really big gain with taking on a slight amount more of risk, this is the opportunity that would be presented to you, right? So GameStop, right? Now, I don't want to get too far off the beaten path here, but GameStop is sitting at 52-week lows, and we pull up Chart Chameleon and we see that it's ranking in the 49th percentile for its historical volatility. We look on the chart on the right, and the 252-day historical volatility is essentially at or near 52-week lows. So this tells me two things about Jackie's idea with regards to a reversal structure and taking a healthy options position. And this is one of those times, right, where one, the chart is at a 52-week low, and two, implied volatility is at some of the lowest implied volatility we have ever seen post-sneeze on GameStop. So GameStop is a fantastic example of the reversal kind of things that I look for, aka the magic ingredients that I look for when also looking to take a healthy options position on a stock for the chance that the thing makes a massive explosion and then those options contracts go crazy, right? So that is number one, right? That is the single most important thing about looking at options, right? Is understanding where is the implied volatility, right? Because what does that mean for my options contracts, right? So the number two thing for me, right? The number two thing is where is the price? Right? I know it seems like such an obvious question, but where is the price? Because the honest truth is, right, on GameStop, and just circle back to this really quickly, right, on GameStop, right, when price was up here, right, why would anybody want to buy options up here at $15? Right, because we just watched this thing not only once or twice or three times or four times, but 5 times rejected this exact price point, right? And so two things are happening in this instance. One, GameStop is at resistance, right? And we never buy at resistance. And two, options contracts are expensive right now. Why are they expensive? Because we just went up $2 in a very small amount of time. And so that starts juicing implied volatility. That also starts juicing the contracts. And then those things start working in combination to start making things more and more and more and more and more expensive, right? And so why do the market makers do this on GameStop all the time? And this goes back, guys, to the lesson that I have been screaming at you for the last probably 6 months, right? It's the emotions of the market, right? The market makes moves like this to get you really, really excited. So you FOMO into contracts that are more expensive than they have ever been. And then when you FOMO into these really expensive contracts and then they pull the rug, your contracts have no chance of coming back, right? No chance of coming back. And then also the thing to consider is what about the people that bought up here, but they bought leaps, right? They bought long dated call options. Well, here's the thing. Right here, GameStop's implied volatility was some of the highest it had ever been in the last year. and the share price was at basically highs that we haven't seen in months, right? So this thing was at highs with options contracts at some of the highest peaks that they had ever been at, right? And then people FOMO into leap options, but what's the deal with leaps? Leaps are also expensive, right? Because implied volatility, right? Implied volatility juices everything. And so that implied volatility also juices the leaps. And then people who bought leaps here, they bought leaps. Let's just say they bought $15 calls on GameStop. They paid $1,000. And then when this thing had the gap down, they were worth $500. And now here, they're worth $375. So in 2 weeks, no, less than 2 weeks, right? In essentially a singular week, a leap option that you bought that doesn't even expire for another, 6, 7, 8 months from now? A leap that you bought that doesn't expire for 6+ months is already down like 75%, right? And so it doesn't make sense, right? Going back to our questions, right? The implied volatility, well, it was really fucking high. And then where is the price? Well, it's at highs that we keep projecting from. And so why do we want to overpay for options contracts when price is at resistance? Don't we all just want to sit there and wait for not just the implied volatility to come down, but for price to go to an area of support before you start buying options contracts, regardless of the expiration, right? Regardless of if you're giving yourself a week, a month, or a year. You want to buy those options contracts not only when they're cheap, but when it makes sense, right? And this is where we add in a layer of technical analysis alongside our options understanding, right? And understanding like buying at support and buying at lows and buying when you put in reversal structures. That's the time that you want to strike with options. Everything else is just nonsense in between. And you don't want to play the nonsense in between because that's how you get liquidated. That's how you don't stay consistent. That's how you find zero consistency. Finding consistency is ignoring the noise between support and resistance, right? And that's why too many retail traders get beat up on options contracts, is because they FOMO in after a big move, but they're FOMOing in at resistance. And then when it starts dumping, the reason that people get shit on puts is because they FOMO in at lows. They FOMO in at support, right? And so when we look at options, you don't want to play the nonsense that's in between, right? You never want to play the nonsense that's in between because options are either expensive or overinflated. So you always want to buy them at support or buy puts at resistance, right? But you don't want the nonsense in between. You want to strike at the highs and strike at the lows. And so that's what I'm trying to make a point to you guys about with regards to the options, right? When a good time to buy it is. That's what this point number 2 is, right? Is where is price, right? Because if price is in some fucking no man's land, you don't want any piece of it. But if price is at historical support after a multi-week downtrend, multi-month, multi-year downtrend, right? Those are the kinds of times where even if you're adding to leap options, they're cheap. And even if price continues to go down, your options don't lose a ton of value. And why is that? Because IV is low. And so your options contracts, when you bought them at support, are at lows. And so yes, even if price goes down, your option will lose value, but it will lose value significantly less value will be lost versus if you're buying at resistance in high IV environments, right? So this is why, like, everybody was asking me when GameStop's earnings and stuff was happening, like, I want no fucking part of any options, right? Because this is going to tie into another thing that I'm going to talk about, which is IV crush. So we're going to come back to this chart. But I just want to finish up the final most important thing, right? So I've listed these in order of their importance, right? So what is the implied volatility and where is the price, right? And then lastly, right? Lastly, is how am I going to trade this, right? And a lot of people don't ask themselves this question before entering options, right? So looking at GameStop, going back to GameStop, right? When people were entering calls up here, right? People were actually doing that, right? We all know this, right? People were entering calls up here, right? And the question is, how am I going to trade this, right? Well, if I'm buying calls here, right, then that means that I don't want to really buy in the money because I'm anticipating a big move, right? I've got my indicator target, so it's like, well, I'm probably going to take an out of the money option, right? But what's the problem with taking an out of the money option here, right? Well, there's a big problem. The IV is high. And so if IV is high, options contracts are worth way more than they should be. So somebody that wants to spend $1,000 on out of the money GameStop calls, right? They're going to pay way more for these out of the money GameStop calls than they would have when price was down here, right? When you're buying $20 calls down here, they're going to be significantly cheaper than when they were here or here or here or here or here. And why is that? Because of high IV, right? And so when options contracts were super expensive and you buy an out of the money option and the thing just plummets, right? You will lose every fucking dollar instantly, overnight. As soon as it dumps, that's it. You've lost every dollar. You bought out of the money. You didn't buy yourself enough time. That's it. You lose every fucking dollar you had on that trade. And that just is what it is, right? And so having a plan, right, will protect you from making poor decisions like this, right? And so what I wanted to circle back around to, right, I didn't buy GameStop puts. Right? I did not buy GameStop puts prior to the earnings. I knew it was going to go down. I didn't know it, right? I had a pretty good, guess, but I didn't buy GameStop puts. And the reason that I didn't buy them is for one very simple reason. All right. Who knows what IV crush is? Who knows what IV crush is? Curious to see. Does the chat know what IV crush is? I'm sure you guys do. So Poor Life Choices says IV crush is when the IV deflates after a major event like earnings. Fantastic. Thank you. That is a beautiful answer. So guys, imagine this, right? You buy GameStop leaps, right? You buy GameStop leaps because you're like, I don't care if GameStop goes down. Even if it goes down for earnings, I don't care. I'll just buy more, right? I'll buy more leaps, right? And so you buy leaps here, and then GameStop does make that move down. But something happens called IV crush. IV, right, is what prices in the move. And then that move happens, right? And so what happens to implied volatility when the very thing it's pricing in happens? Well, implied volatility plummets, right? It doesn't just plummet, it dies. And this is called IV crush. And so this is why the $1,000 fucking calls that you were buying here are now only worth $250 here, or whatever I said, $375, whatever it is, right? The $1,000 calls that you buy here are now only worth $375. And the reason that they're worth that is because of IV crush. IV crush, right? IV, we know, is the multiplier for options. And IV crush is the multiplier crush. And so the very thing that multiplies your options and makes it more expensive and makes it go brrr, right? If that very thing gets crushed, what do you think happens to your options? They also get crushed. And the reason that I didn't buy GameStop puts here, even though we had a huge fucking move, right? We had a huge move, right? The honest truth is GameStop puts only went up like 120%. And yes, wow, 120%, Jackie, you really, I'm not complaining about that. It's that the risk did not justify the reward. Between earnings, a potential gap up, gap down, whatever, plus the IV crush that was almost certainly going to hit both puts and calls. because IV crush multiplies everything. Right? When IV dies, so does all of the options contracts with it, not just calls, but also puts. And so when this move happened, guess what? When we gap down, even if you had $15 puts, literally in the money puts, you buy in the money puts, and we made this huge gap down for $2, GameStop puts were only up 30% that morning. You had to hold for this extra piece to get that 120%. You had to hold through this. That first initial move, you only got 30%. So imagine somebody that was buying out of the money GameStop puts, and then it gapped down, and they're like, oh my God, I'm going to be fucking rich. And then they opened it up and they were red. You want to know why they were red? Because of IV crush. Because they bought an out of the money option that didn't go in the money. They didn't buy themselves enough time, and implied volatility destroyed all options. Because the very thing that implied volatility was pricing in, which was this gap down or a gap up, whatever, the very thing that was being priced in happened. And so implied volatility inherently gets crushed. And that's what makes your options contracts lose value. And that's why even puts that were deep in the money were only up 30% the very next morning, even after a 15% gap down. That is why. And so these are the three questions, right? These are the three most important questions we have to ask, right? What is the implied volatility? Where is the price? And how am I going to trade this? And those three rules will protect you from losing money on options contracts. Kevin Gubenlian, if the expected earnings move is 15%, but a stock moves 20%, then IV would actually go up after earnings instead of crush, correct? That is correct. That is actually what we saw with Carvana. So you guys remember we took the ghetto spread on the earnings for Carvana, and Carvana had a 30% move priced in. Carvana made a 32%, I think it was actually a 20% move priced in. Carvana made a 32% move gap up the very next day. And then since then, Carvana has continued to make significant moves. And so if we actually just type in CVNA here and we head over to the implied volatility, which is in here somewhere, you'll see Carvana's volatility. It says it only ranks in the 46th percentile. But if you open up the 252-day, right, you'll see that the volatility, while it is still near 52-week lows, right, you can see that that volatility has stayed in a relatively tight range. And sitting at 114 for volatility, that is very, very high. So yes, you are right that after the move happens, if the earnings move or whatever move it is that volatility is pricing in, if it is significantly more or less, right, depending if it's a downside or an upside move, if it is more, typically the IV continues to remain elevated. And then that high IV is what can help propel the options contracts to just go insane. I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the ghetto spread that we had on Carvana actually ended up doing over 1,000% gain. And part of that reason was because implied volatility was already high here, and it was pricing in a 20% move. And then you got a 32% move. It was actually 50, I think, at one point in the day. And so you guys can imagine that the very thing that volatility was pricing in, it basically doubled it. And so that volatility remained high, and that's why the options contract stayed really, really high on Carvana. And so, yes, Kevin, that's a great question. Who or what controls IV? The market makers? Yes, essentially, yes. And also part of what happens is it's done through the options chain. Is sometimes the market starts pricing in things because they see things happening through the options chain. But yes, for the most part, implied volatility is kind of like through the options chain / through the market makers, yes. And then there was one more thing there. I presume IV rockets or craters is based on supply and demand of the options. That's you're damn close. You're damn close, Scott. Right? You're damn close. So essentially, that's what I was going to like. That's kind of what I'm saying there with regards to the options chain itself. right, is so the options chain starts to either see an increase in volume of out of the money strikes, right? That's kind of how the VIX works, right? You guys kind of know this, is that the VIX works off of 30-day out of the money puts on SPX, right? That's how the VIX works. And so you guys can kind of imagine that the VIX is literally a volatility gauge, right? And so if the VIX is a volatility gauge of, essentially SPX, you guys can kind of imagine that how this thing functions is essentially how implied volatility on each one of these stocks functions as well. So let me just pause here and let me just ask you guys, is everybody with me? Does everybody understand what I have laid out so far? Does that all make sense to you guys? Okay, good. All right, good. So we've gone through a good majority of the lesson so far. So now I've actually wanted to use an example. Okay, so I've given you kind of the tools on how to protect yourself when buying options and knowing when to buy options. Okay, so let's talk about how these options kind of function, right? So you've got out of the money and in the money, right? And then you've got short dated and you've got leaps. So I've circled an area on AMC prior to the squeeze in January and then the gamma squeeze that happened in May. Okay, and so price at this current scenario down in this green circle. Okay, implied volatility at the time was relatively low and the price was sitting between $10 to $11. So let's discuss leaps taken versus short dated options taken. So let's say you had taken a leap position on AMC inside of this green circle. Okay, so you took a leap position within AMC inside of that green circle. And then you guys can see I've put on a $20 strike call, which is way outside of the money. And then I've put down a $10 strike call, which is essentially in the money. Okay, so we've taken two different strike prices and these are the leaps. Okay, so we've purchased them in a low IV environment, so the contracts were considered cheap. So in this circled green area, the implied volatility was low. And that means that when we were buying leaps, right, 12 months to expire, okay, so we were buying January of 2022 leaps, right, $10 and $20 strikes, right? They were considered cheap at the time, okay? They were considered cheap. So they were considered good value. And if you go with Jackie's little trading... Sorry, someone's at the door. 1 second. Sorry, we had we had groceries delivered, so the dog went fucking bananas. It's pretty epic. What's a high or low percentage when it comes to IV? I mean, typically, it's dependent on stock to stock. So I like to go on to Chart Chameleon and essentially use the 252 day, and then I like to get a rough average. And then if I'm taking like a shorter trade idea, like I'll say SPWH, for example, right? I would kind of more focus on like the 30 or the 20 and just give myself kind of a rough idea of where it has been between the high and the low and the average. And then that gives me a rough idea, but I would say it really varies stock to stock. So So back to where we were. So we were looking at leaps, right? And so we said that the contracts were cheap, which was great, right? So we were buying really cheap contracts. And then if we were following Jackie's rule, we were looking for a reversal structure at support, which it just so happens that this was support, right? And so this was a really good time to buy options, right? And so we're going to look at both scenarios, right? And so we're looking at the leaps first, right? And so when AMC made this huge first move, right, in January, if you had taken leaps down here, right, and this thing went up here and you had those leap options, right, AMC went up $80, right? It went $80 from where you had taken an initial position on that, right? And so we know that using these multipliers, right, that the closer that this $20 option started getting to being in the money, the more that this started to really explode in value, right? And so we know that when this thing went up $80, that our $20 strike call was way in the money, way in the money. And so we already know, right, that when this had this huge explosion, right, when it had this huge explosion, right, we know that this option was going to make us a shitload of money, right? But here's the deal, right? We're looking at leaps versus a 1 month to expire one, right? And I want you to focus on the deltas versus the thetas, right, of each of these strikes versus the time to time, right? So when we had these leaps and we had this huge explosion, right, essentially what you do, okay, so let's dive into the Greeks here just for a little second, right? Delta, okay, delta is the very thing that multiplies your option contract, right? So delta, right, we bought this $10 strike leap, right, for $500. And the delta is 0.2. So that means that for every $1 that AMC goes up or down, the delta of 0.2 will get added onto this contract. So when AMC went up its first $10, right, essentially the delta, now this isn't exactly how it works, I'm just giving you the most basics here, right? Essentially you would take this 0.2 and multiply it by 10, and that's how much we would be adding on to the price of this option. So it's $20 times 10 is $200. So this option now, after the first $10 move, right, this option here, okay, would be worth $700. Now, the reason that I'm breaking it down this simple for you, right, is there's a plethora of other things that add more value to these things, right? You have gamma, and then you have implied volatility. Those two things also juice this contract, right? And those two things are the reason why this $20 contract ultimately ends up having a larger percentage gain, because you bought this $20 strike out of the money, right? We bought this one and it was out of the money when we purchased it down here. And then we made that first $10 move up and suddenly that call was in the money, right? And so delta being at 0.1, right, multiply by 10, it's an extra $100. But because of the things like gamma and IV, right, they're like a slot machine for this thing. And this thing, because it went up so violently and so rapidly in pace, the slot machine IV booster juicer, right, started just exploding this contract's value, because you went from being out of the money to in the money in the span of essentially 4 days. So this delta, by the time that you had made that first $10 move, that delta is now actually 1.0. So for every $1 up now, for when AMC was here, every $1 up now from here, the delta is going to increase that contract by $100. Now imagine price goes up 70 more fucking dollars. Imagine how much that $20 strike that you bought at $150 was worth by the time this thing made that huge move, right? Now here's the difference between the leap and the short dated one, right? Now with short dated, we have to be aware that when we buy short dated, you are expecting that move to happen that same week that you buy it. I don't care if you buy 1 month to expire or 1 week to expire. My rule of thumb is that when I take a short dated option, I am expecting the move to happen that week. And if the move does not happen that week, I will close the option and I'll just buy it again. I'll buy it later. But when I buy short dated, the expectation is the move is happening and it's happening right fucking now. Right? Because you're taking on way more risk. Right? Look at the theta values, right? So if you're unaware, theta is the thing that eats at your contract, right? So let's say that you buy a 1 week to expire option, right? You buy a 1 week to expire option and price does this for a week, right? It literally just goes like does nothing, right? When price does nothing, how come your option goes down? Well, the reason your option goes down is because of theta. Theta is the thing that eats away at your contract. And this contract here, with only a month to expire, it loses $25 every single day. Every single day, you lose $25 on that contract. Whereas on the leaps, every single day, you're only losing $5. So if the price doesn't move, every single day, you're going to lose $5 on the leaps, versus every day that it doesn't move on your short dated, you're going to lose $25. That's literally 400% more. No, excuse me, sorry. That's 500% more that you're costing yourself. Yes, theta is the time value decay. That is correct. So for every day that the share price doesn't move or it doesn't do shit, you're costing yourself money. And that's what theta is. And that's why these short dated options, right? If the move that you were hoping to see does not happen right away, that's why you want to close them, because you don't want to lose money to not just delta if the price goes down, but also to theta, right? Because they're so much harsher on short dated contracts, right? So does everybody, you guys all understand that? Does that make sense? That's a really difficult concept. So I want to pause and just make sure that you guys all understand that. Is everybody with me on that? And this is kind of some higher end stuff, guys. So if it's confusing or it doesn't make sense, like, don't be afraid to stop me or ask silly questions. I'll answer any silly questions. There's no such thing as a silly question. But I just want to make sure, right? Because this is a really important lesson, right? This lesson, a lot of you guys are going to carry going forward, and you're going to remember a lot of the things taken from here today. Okay? So the big thing that I want to point out, and why I am a big proponent of leap options, is because of exactly what happened on AMC's chart. Okay? Now, imagine you, okay, you person listening to me, bought AMC leaps and some 1 month to expires, right? And some shares, because price was at support, and you're like, I'm a really good trader. I'm going to buy a handful of everything. I'm going to buy some shares, some short dated, and some leaps, because I think a move is happening right now. And then let's say you get lucky and it makes a huge move, right? But you think AMC is going to go higher, right? It hits this peak and you're like, I think it's going to go higher. And then it starts coming down and you're like, guys, I still think it's going to go higher. I think AMC is going to squeeze, right? Imagine you sold your short dated options here and you held your leaps, right? You held your leaps. Why did you hold your leaps? Well, because you have 12 months to expire and you think price is going to go higher and you think it's going to take less than a year to get there. So if it happens in less than a year, the leaps that you didn't sell will ultimately be worth more when price explodes. But the short dated ones, you want to offload those quick, because the big move happened. The huge move that you wanted to see happen, it happened. And you were able to get out. And you made a bunch of money. But the leap options, you were confident. You were confident AMC was going to go higher. And so you held those leaps. And then price made another huge move. And altogether, right? Altogether, AMC's share price went up $376 from the moment that you had bought it. I don't have to be the first one to tell you that if the delta is 0.2 and you multiply it by 376, which is not even exactly how you're supposed to do it, right? Because it's actually way fucking more than that. But we're just going to do it the most basic way. If you held a leap and you sold it all the way at the peak, you guys, those options, right? Those options Okay? Those things were trading at roughly $10,000. $10,000 per contract. Can you imagine having bought a Leap on AMC down here for 500, buying like 10 of them, and then selling them up here because you were smart and you bought shares, short dated and Leaps, and then it made that huge move and you cashed in heavily, but you thought it was going to keep going higher and then it did, and then you ultimately got to walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in gains, right? This is why options are not meant to be fucked with. But when the opportunity presents itself, aka where is the price, right? When this opportunity presents itself, having those Leap options and having the conviction in the share price continuing to go higher, it can seriously lead to exponential gains, right? And then as you guys begin to understand more about options and we dig more into this kind of stuff, I'll teach you guys more about how to sell options and how you can use selling options as a means to actually generating income for yourself with a position, right? A lot of people could have really saved themselves a lot of stress if they had sold options on AMC during all of this nonsense that went on for the last few years, right? Now, I don't blame anybody, and nobody should take personal blame for that, because the honest truth is a lot of people got fucked over on AMC, and a lot of people were new to trading. And so a lot of people didn't understand how to sell options and hedge their position and do all of this stuff. So don't beat yourself up too badly, right? But we're going to give you the tools and the techniques and the tricks and the tips on how you can protect yourself, right, in the event of the stock that you hold going down, and how you can actually make more money while the stock is in the process of going up, right? Especially if you hold a heavy position on it. But today's lesson, I just desperately wanted to get across to you guys how important it is to understand what you are doing with options, right? Because the options, you can't, too many of us are just like randomly buying at options, right? And we're just randomly fucking buying them for no reason other than we're just excited because we think the stock is going to go up, right? That's why some of us buy options, and we just can't do that anymore, right? We've got to outsmart the hedge funds, and we've got to learn how to beat the market. And beating the market means understanding when and why we buy options. And options are meant to be a tool, right? They aren't meant to be a get-rich-quick scheme. They're meant to be a tool, right? And when we pull out specialized tools in specialized events and specialized circumstances, we can take advantage of this tool to make us a whole bunch of money. But it is not a tool that you take out every single day and just use it, right? This is a specialized tool for special circumstances, right? So this is why I've been sharing with you guys some of the option stuff, but why I'm very open and very transparent about the fact that I focus mostly just on shares right now, right? So, can I get a quick GG and TG? I just want to make sure everybody's still here, everybody's still good, everybody's still watching and understanding. Do you have any questions about anything on the chart here? Is there anything that you were curious about? Any multiplier questions, any of the Greeks, anything like that? Ask any questions, because we're getting close to wrapping up here. We're getting pretty close to wrapping up. All right, thank you guys all for those GGs and TGs. Okay, so this is not financial advice. All right, let me preface this by saying this is not financial advice. If you do this or listen to some random guy from YouTube for doing this, then joke's on you. But this is Baba. These are pretty lines and pretty drawings and pretty stuff on a pretty chart. And Baba is one of those rare examples in which a stock price is close to its low, it's putting in a reversal formation, and the implied volatility is relatively low. So if you guys haven't seen this, Baba's implied volatility is currently in this 2 percentile rank. So Baba's current implied volatility is some of the fucking lowest it has ever been historically. I mean ever, right? And so I was looking at Baba, and I have talked to you guys about this lots, and I have bought plenty of shares, plenty for myself personally. It's not a huge position, but I've bought enough that satisfies me so far. And I would say that this is one of those rare occasions where taking some 2026 leaps or even some 2025, maybe closer to in the money, again, not financial advice, this is kind of one of those rare occasions where it might actually justify some level of trade like that. Given that this is one of the largest tech stocks in China, it is the Amazon of China trading at essentially 52-week lows. It is some of the deepest value on the market. And with the implied volatility being as low as it is, and as I've stated, the stock being in a reversal structure at a 52-week low, it's hard not to imagine that taking some leap options on Baba wouldn't be one of the best short-term examples of a stock that you should just maybe perhaps consider the idea of, definitely not financial advice, buying and probably holding for like 1 to 2+ years. Because this is the kind of stock where you could buy, leap options. And again, not financial advice. I'll just keep saying it so everybody understands. Where you could take leap options that were maybe in the money at 70, and then maybe at 80, and then maybe at 90, and then maybe you give yourself 2 years to get to like 100 or even like 150. And then Lord forbid, like, a year and a half from now, Baba is trading at like 200 and some dollars, and you bought leap options that have 2+ years or 1+ year to expire, and they're already in the money, and price continues to go higher, and then those leap options in combination with your shares could ultimately net you hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not even make you a millionaire. So me personally, I have started accumulating some leap positions on Baba for 2026. Again, not financial advice, but this seems like one of those premium examples of a stock trading at a low with super low IV, meaning that the contracts are essentially the cheapest that they have ever been. And if the share price does explode from here, and it does find a double bottom, and it does put in a reversal, once again, I will say this out loud, right? Those leap options could be worth tens of thousands of dollars each contract individually. And I don't think that you're going to be upset with yourself if this thing just so happened to do something like that. So this is kind of one of those things where if I was, looking back at that AMC chart, considering, having taken leap options here and then AMC was trading way up here, this could be like a Baba chart. And so I think that it's really interesting, and I definitely think that Baba is something that if you're unfamiliar with options, taking a Baba leap and understanding where liquidity lies would be a really, really, really interesting thing to do. Again, not financial advice. And so the last thing before I sign off that I want to touch on with regards to all of the stuff that I've talked here today, lastly, right, is do I understand them enough to trade them? Right? We understand why implied volatility is important. We understand when it's a good time to buy options versus shares. We understand how we can protect our asses, which is by following the 3 simple rules. But the final question is, do I understand this enough to trade them, right? And one of the things that is important in understanding this piece right here is open interest. Okay? Why is open interest so important, and why is this a reason to understanding how these options work, right? So I'll give you an example. I traded a stock called Sava back when. I don't remember exactly when it was. I think it was somewhere over here. And I had bought puts on Sava somewhere. I think it was like over in here. This was when I was dumb. So I bought puts on Sava, and I didn't realize that the puts on Sava had no liquidity, aka no open interest, right? Aka no buyers and sellers. And when there's no buyers and sellers, even when the share price makes a move in my direction and I want to sell it, there's nobody there to buy it off of me. And so even though I should in theory be making money, if nobody is buying the option contract off of me, I can't sell it. So I can't sell it for a profit. Right? So one of the single most important things to understand when it comes to options is open interest. Where are people buying this the options chain, right? If we look at GameStop, right? If we look at GameStop on the Max Payne chart for next week, right? Well, if we bought a $6 put, do you think anybody would buy that $6 put off of us? Even if it went in the money? No, because there's no fucking liquidity here. But what if we bought a $12 call and GameStop started exploding? Do you think we'd have trouble selling this? No, because there is a ton of liquidity here, right? And so look at a thing like Sava, for example. So look at a Sava monthly option here once it loads eventually. Maybe. Okay, let's try Baba instead. Okay, or it's just not going to work because it said, fuck you. Okay, but it's actually not going to work. Okay, so that's good. So one of the most important things is finding out where that open interest and that volume lies. And another way that you can do this, okay, is using a resource like Bar Chart. Okay, so Bar Chart has options. You can go to options pricing here. Okay, you can actually open up. So we're on, what stock is this? We're on AMC. Let's find the AMC monthly. So here's the AMC monthly, and then we're going to show 50 plus strikes. And then we're going to sort by open interest, right? And so we can see there's a shitload of open interest on the $5 calls, the $4 calls, 9, 350, and 6, right? So if we were buying calls on AMC, we certainly wouldn't want to fucking buy 7.5, right? Because there's nobody buying them. But if we were bullish on AMC and we thought AMC was going to make a huge move, maybe we'd buy $5 calls. Why would we buy $5 calls? Look at the open interest. There is lots of buyers and lots of sellers. So if our contract makes us money and we want to go sell it, there's going to be a lot of willing buyers to buy that contract from us, right? So understanding open interest is kind of like the final key to options, right? Open interest is the final key to options. You identify where are the most amount of buyers or sellers. Is there an opportunity here? Are the contracts cheap, and how am I going to execute this trade? If those 4 things you can put together and formulate a proper trade, then you indeed do understand this enough to trade them. And if that is confusing, then you've got more work to do. Right? But there's nothing wrong with more work. It just means more time in the market and more time to understand these things. But believe me when I say options are a fantastic tool when used correctly, but very few use them correctly. More of them use them as like a YOLO thing, right? And I don't really do that. I just strike when the iron's hot. And so we identify these opportunities such as BABA, such as GME, right? We identify these opportunities and then we strike while the iron's hot. Those are not cheap. Well, of course they're not cheap. You're buying literally 2 years worth of premium. Right? So yes, BABA Leap options are not going to be cheap. They're going to be cheap relative to the price. Right? They're going to be cheap relative to the price. An $80 BABA call is going to be quadruple. No, it's going to be literally 100x more expensive than an $80 AMC call. Because AMC is $73 away from 80 and BABA is $9. And so all of that premium is baked in because of the share price. That's what options use to trade, is the share price. And so the share price of BABA, while it is expensive, is low relative to its 52-week lows. And not only is it low relatively to its 52-week lows, the implied volatility is in the lowest, basically 98% that it has ever been. And so you factor in those two things. Yes, BABA options for leaps, $80 leaps or $90 leaps, are not going to be cheap. Of course, they're going to be like $1,000+. But you're buying 2 years worth of premium. You're buying 2 years worth of time. And then you're essentially giving yourself 700 days for the price to go up $9. This thing has gone down $9 faster. Right? So they're not cheap. Of course they're not cheap, but they're cheap relative to what BABA's options trade for. It's all relative to what you think is cheap, but cheap is what the stock is. The options of the stock are cheap. Right? Like it's the same thing with GameStop. Right? GameStop options don't trade anything like NVIDIA options, because NVIDIA is worth 9x the price of GameStop right now. It's like 19x the price, but The reason NVIDIA options are expensive is because of the share price. And it's no different than Baba or Microsoft or Google or Amazon or any of those things. You don't find, I'll say, quote unquote, cheap options on those things unless you're buying deep out of the money. Right? So that's kind of how these things, cheap is relative to the stock. I don't mean cheap like in our brains, whatever your brain processes as cheap. I don't mean it like that. I mean relative to what the share price and what the option itself trades for. Volume is the amount of options that get moved throughout the day, and then open interest is what's remaining on the options chain after the day is over. So, for example, on this AMC one right here, right, we can see that the open interest change there was minus 2,400 contracts, right? And then we can see that the volume on this $3.50 strike was 6,600, right? So if the open interest change was minus 2,000 and the volume was 6,600, that means, or what that essentially implies, is that based on the prior day, right, 6,600 $3.50 calls changed hands, and of those 6,600, we essentially lost open interest to the tune of 2,400. That means that people sold this option, likely took profit. And it looks to me like they took profit and then they rolled the profit that they took from this strike and they rolled it into the $3 strike. Because we see that same volume, but the open interest changed from minus 2,400 to plus 2,500. So it almost seems as though somebody has taken the money that they had on the $3.50 calls and they've actually rolled them into now $3 calls. So they've taken off less risk because it's out of the money. AMC trading at $3 right now. So they've essentially taken off the risk of being out of the money and then taken that and placed it in the money. Okay, and they've placed that in the money by buying the $3 calls. And so the way that we use volume versus open interest is the volume shows us the number of contracts traded throughout the day. The open interest shows us the change from the day prior. So we can see that the day prior, right, we lost 2,400 $3.50 calls of open interest. But that same 2,400 just rolled in to $3 strike calls. All right, so does that make sense? Oh, I think that makes sense. That was pretty good. Can predict the stock price based on open interest? No, I wouldn't say that. No, because open interest is comprised of a whole bunch of traders. It can be whales, it can be stupid retail, it can just be a plethora of traders. And so you can use it as an idea of where traders are hopeful or anticipating price to go towards, but I wouldn't say it's kind of like the end all be all metric of like where is price going, because the truth is, right, is if, you know, does the Max Payne thing work yet? Because if I can open up the GME Max Payne, you guys will see that for the April expiration, Kevin Malone was talking about this on Twitter, right? But he's wrong, not to be rude, but he's wrong. So he said that a whole bunch of people were buying like 30 strike calls on GameStop last week and they weren't. What happens, right? What open interest? So on this chart here, this is GameStop open interest by strike, okay? And look at all the open interest at the 40 strike call, right? Do we think GameStop's going to $40 next week? No. No, it's definitely, like, I can tell you 100%, no doubt in my mind, GameStop's not going to 40 next week, right? And so what the open interest here shows is dumb retail. Dumb retail bought a whole bunch of call options in high IV environment on GameStop, right? They bought a shitload of GameStop calls right here, right? They bought 40 strike calls on GameStop expiring next month. And then they overpaid for them. Implied volatility dumped. Now GameStop's down here. And so they've lost pretty much every single dollar. So every single bit of open interest in here is pretty much all 22,496 calls are basically worthless right now. Right? They're pretty much worthless. I can actually show you, because if we go to bar chart and I go to GME instead of AMC, and then we find those very May, right? That was May, or was that April? That's April 19th, right? I think. Let me just make sure. Yeah, it was. Okay. So we can find those April 19th 40 strikes. And so here they are, and they're currently trading at $2. Right? They're currently trading at $2. So they're essentially worthless, right? So nobody's going to close out those contracts, right? Nobody's going to close out that 25,000 open interest on the $40 calls because they're not worth anything. So the open interest is not necessarily a predictor of where price is going. It's just to be used as kind of like a guideline of what traders are expecting. But as soon as the move doesn't happen, this is like all but a guarantee that every single one of these contracts is going to expire worthless. Every single one of them. Yeah, Triz was selling them. All right. So, guys, I think that is going to be it. I think that's going to be it for our little options lesson. So, can I get a bunch of GGs and TGs in the chat? Can I get a bunch of GGs and TGs in the chat box, please? How do you know if they're selling or buying calls? You don't. You pray. We try to use unusual whales, but other than unusual whales, it's impossible to know if they're buying or selling. Didn't nap through this one this time. Attaboy, Triz. Way to go. I was hoping Maple was going to show up because he's missed every single one, and now he's slept through another one, I think. So, good to see you, everybody. Great to see all of you guys. Thank you all for tuning in. So, 4-6, Antrich, Carmen, David Stevens, David's Trinidad, Cowboy, Robert Santiago, Benanito, Trizza, Scott Baker, Calvin Locke, Poor Life Choices, David. Who else we got in here? Romer, Mike Hawkins Small, Cold Grape Sodas, Kevin Gubenlian. Who else? Carson Nichols. Who else? There were some other names I saw in here earlier. Generic Display Name. My Home. Dean Lycos. Chang Gang Gang. Nice Afro. Brian Ballas. Ja A. Anybody else? Anybody else I'm missing? It's your last chance to get in, guys. Last chance. All right. Well, that is it, gang. Thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully, I'll have a GameStop video out here later tonight. Just a quick little update. So, looking at futures. So, IWM futures have opened up at 0.3, and then NASDAQ and SPY futures are up 0.1. So, not a huge opening from the market. And is that just open now? It is. Wow. So bonds had a huge gap down. So bonds had a pretty significant gap down. So that'll be interesting to monitor going into Monday. And then let's check out crypto really quick. So Vara up 11%. Bitcoin was okay. So with the market open, crypto did not die. And so I guess we will continue that story tomorrow. But yeah, so far so good on the market opens and all that kind of stuff, guys. So thank you once again, you guys, for tuning in. And yeah, I will see you guys in the Discord, and I will see you guys on Monday. So thank you all. That was roughly an hour and 20 minutes, give or take. So thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate your time, and I will see you guys back in the Discord. See you later. Bye-bye.